Good afternoon. Welcome to this event in the Voices of Our Time speaker series. This series is designed to bring to the campus community important leaders for discussions of significant national and international issues of our time. Tonight our session is part of the Symposium, The Human Face of Environmental Inequality. I invite all of you to continue tonight's conversations at the sessions tomorrow and the closing keynote address by Andrew Revkin. Tonight we are honored to welcome to Wake Forest a leader of genuine renown. The Honorable Mary Robinson has served with distinction her home country of Ireland, the community of the European Economic Union, and the entire global community. A barrister and professor of law at Trinity College Dublin, she served for 2 decades in the Irish Senate, and then in 1990 was elected the President of Ireland, the first female to hold that position. In 1997, she became the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva. Later, she served the United Nations Secretary General as Special Envoy for the Great Lakes region of Africa. And last year, she became the UN Secretary General Special Envoy for Climate Change. Today, she is also president of the Mary Robin Foundation Climate Justice, which is based in Dublin. Her numerous awards include the Presidential Medal of Freedom given by President Obama. After Dr. Robbins' lecture, John Knox, the Henry Lerman Professor of International Law at Wake Forest, will pose some questions to Dr. Robinson. In July 2012, the United Nations Human Rights Council appointed John to a 3-year mandate as its first independent expert on the issue of human rights obligations related to the environment. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Mary Robinson.
Thank you very much, President Hatch, for that warm introduction. And I'm delighted to be here today at Wake Forest University and to be honored to be asked to give a speech as a voice of our time. And of course, I'm also very happy in a chapel, Waite Chapel, as a woman, to be up here with all of you as a captive audience. Indeed, I feel I'm among kindred spirits when I read the college motto, Pro Humanitate, for humanity. It resonates very strongly with the work that we're doing in my foundation in trying to have a people-centered approach to climate change. On February the 1st, 1960, a little over 30 miles from here, the lunch counter sit-in by the Greensbury Four marked a significant moment in the fight for racial equality in this country. 55 years later, one of the 4 young men who staged the sit-in, Jibril Kassan, has said, and I quote him, that climate change is young people's lunch counter moment for the 21st century. He also says, and I quote him again, it is the biggest threat to justice and opportunity our planet has ever seen. I too believe that climate change is the biggest threat to humanity of the 21st century. The impacts of climate change on people's lives and their enjoyment of their human rights are what brought me to the issue of climate change. I'm not a climate change scientist. I didn't even do environmental law particularly as a lawyer. Climate change is, I believe, not just an issue of atmospheric science. It's also about human rights and about injustice because of the impact it's having on the poorest countries and communities. In other words, it's what gets me out of bed every morning with a sense of urgency. The evidence that the climate is changing and that human beings are largely responsible for the changes shouldn't in any way now be disputed. I know in some sectors here in the United States there are skeptics. They have no grounds anymore for being skeptical or being in denial. The 10 warmest years since record began in the 19th century have all been since 1997, and 2014, last year, was the Earth's hottest year on record. The fifth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released in 2014, identified that the actions taken by the world to date to limit climate change have been grossly inadequate. And if we continue business as usual, we are on track for a 4 degrees warmer world compared with pre-industrial levels. And this, as a report from the World Bank called Turn Down the Heat pointed out 2 years ago, this would be catastrophic. So here we are, facing the prospect that we're heading to a future that would be extreme and with potentially irreversible impacts. If we don't take action to keep warming of the Earth's atmosphere as far below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels as possible, we're sure that heat waves will occur more often and last longer, and that extreme precipitation, heavy rain events will become more intense and frequent in many regions. The oceans will continue to warm and acidify, and global mean sea level will continue to rise. About 70% of coastlines worldwide are projected to experience a sea level change. Here in this state, the State Climate Office of North Carolina reports the sea level along North Carolina's coast has risen a foot since observations began in the 1930s. And future climate forecasts suggest the sea level may increase another 2 to 3 feet over the next 100 years. That brings with it many potential negative impacts on those who live along the 300 plus miles of North Carolina coastline, undermining the full enjoyment of their human rights. Unfortunately, we don't need to look to the future to see the impacts of climate change. It's real, and it's here, and it's now, and it's hurting a lot of people. As President Anutang Chung of the Republic of Kiribati said at a recent Human Rights Council meeting, and I quote him, "Climate change for us, low-lying islands, is no longer a future event. It is happening now." We can all see the devastation brought by extreme weather events, Hurricane Katrina, Superstorm Sandy, Super Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, the recent devastation in Vanuatu of Cyclone Pam, and recent unprecedented flooding in Malawi and Mozambique. These extreme weather events will become more frequent and more intense because of climate change. So while science tells us the tipping point is a 2-degree warmer world, for many people, typically the most vulnerable, their tipping point is already here. I was very happy to hear that this lecture would take place during the Human Face of Environmental Inequality Symposium. I think it's very important that we keep a human face to these discussions. To me, the human face of climate change is women like Ursula Rokova, whom I've got to know quite well. Ursula is leading the resettlement of her community of some 1,500 people from a small Carteret island to Papua New Guinea. They can no longer live on their island, and she's a leader, so she's responsible for trying to ensure that they can have a future somewhere because of rising sea levels. Ursula's people are among those who have contributed least to the problem of climate change, yet they're the ones who must find a new home. She has bought land in Papua New Guinea. She has negotiated with the authorities in Papua New Guinea that they can move there and be accommodated as 1,500 people who didn't come from there. And then she says, with great sadness in her eyes, she said, "But there is nothing I can do about the fact that we have to move from the land of the bones of our ancestors." And for anybody who knows what that means to Indigenous people, it's the deepest hurt and tragedy, because they link with Earth, they link with Mother Earth, they link with the bones of their ancestors, and they have to move somewhere else. That's the tragedy that they face now, not sometime in the future. Too often we tend to focus on the processes, the agreements, the international discussions, the UN speak, and this allows us to detach ourselves from the human impacts of climate change. That's why my foundation focuses on climate justice. Climate justice links human rights and development to achieve a human-centered approach, safeguarding the rights of the most vulnerable and sharing the burdens and benefits of climate change and its resolution equitably and fairly. This connection between human rights and climate change has been made in several resolutions of the Human Rights Council since 2008. These resolutions recognize the negative impacts of climate change on the enjoyment of human rights, in particular for those segments of the population that are already in vulnerable situations, owing to factors such as geography, poverty, gender, age, Indigenous or minority status, and disability. They also point to the fact that human rights obligations, standards, and principles have the potential to inform and strengthen international, regional, and national policymaking in the area of climate change, promoting better policy coherence, better legitimacy, and sustainable outcomes. So human rights can inform and improve climate policy. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiations have taken on board these issues also. The agreement that was reached at the Conference of the Parties, generally known as a COP, at the COP in Cancun, includes a reference to existing human rights obligations and, in quotes, I'm quoting now from the text, emphasizes that parties should, in all climate-related actions, fully respect human rights. The challenge now is to ensure that the negative impacts of climate change on people's rights prompt the global community to take urgent and ambitious action on climate change, and that in shaping this action and making it as inclusive and as equitable as possible, we're guided by human rights obligations. The end result of this approach will be more effective climate action. 2015 presents the world with a significant opportunity to ensure that we deliver such an action. We'll see deliberations conclude on a new set of sustainable development goals which will apply to all countries, which will be adopted at the Special Summit on Sustainable Development in New York in September. Following this will be the signing of a new climate agreement in Paris in December. The coming together of these processes creates a unique opportunity to stabilize climate and transform the lives of billions of people. I sometimes reflect on 2 years that stand out in my lifetime, or even before my lifetime, in their importance. The first year was 1945. 1945 was the year when the world had experienced 2 world wars, a Holocaust, an opening up of a Cold War, the dropping of atomic bombs in Japan. And you heard the mantra, never again. And the world came together in solidarity. We got the Charter of the United Nations. We got a Marshall Plan for Europe. We got the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And a few years later, we got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, because people felt we have to do something and we have to really move in solidarity or we're doomed. 2015 is another year like that. It's a year when we have very big decisions to make globally that will help us to change course from the wrong course we're on at the moment, where we're not on a pathway to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. We need the Sustainable Development Goals, which have a goal on climate change, and indeed, of the 17 goals, 12 of them are very relevant to climate change. So they're very linked to the climate agreement. But what the climate agreement has to do is to make sure that we stay true to the science and stay below 2 degrees Celsius of warming. So we're looking in 2015 for a robust set of agreements which guarantee a pathway to end extreme poverty, to reduce inequality, and to minimize the risks posed to development from climate change. To do this and ensure we get a fair and equitable agreement, the world needs all of you, all of us. This is too important to be left to political leaders. You have to be the voices of your time. Political leaders will not act with the necessary sense of urgency, equity, and ambition unless they feel a groundswell of support from their constituencies. And that groundswell is happening, and happening more and more. I don't know if any of you had the pleasure that I had of marching in New York last September for the Climate March. It was anticipated that maybe as many as 100,000 people might come out on the streets of New York. But in fact, 400,000 people came out. And it was a wonderful occasion because people were there wanting to be with everyone else, to say, enough is enough, we want urgent action now. I was with Gru Brundtland, we were elders together with our placard on behalf of the elders. And then I saw another placard and I kind of wanted to move away from Gru Brundtland and get behind that placard because it said simply, angry grannies. And I felt that suited me down to the ground. So, you know, we really do have to somehow get the sense across that people have to be talking to their governments about what needs to be done. I'd like to borrow the words of someone I truly admired. I met her a number of times, but I know she was a great friend of Wake Forest and herself a real champion of justice, Dr. Maya Angelou. She said, "Let the need for change bulldoze a road down the center of your mind. Let the need for change bulldoze a road down the center of your mind." And that's what's needed. We somehow have to get this message across of the need to change course. The summit on climate change in December will focus on 4 pillars, as outlined by the French government, which has the presidency of the conference. The first is the legal framework agreement. The second is the intended contributions that all countries have now said that they will make to reduce carbon emissions. The third is about climate financing. And the fourth includes activities of all other sectors. Obviously, the business sector is very important, forests, cities, but also civil society, all of us. This issue, as I said, is too important to be left to political leaders alone. We all need to engage. I have to admit with a certain humility that when I had the honor to serve as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights from 1997 to 2002, climate change wasn't in the front of my mind. In the years since then, the impacts of what seemed a distant threat have become a harsh reality, and that led me to establish my foundation on climate justice. We need to change the debate on climate change, to move beyond its construct as a scientific or environmental problem, and to realize that it is, in essence, an issue of development and rights. Taking a climate justice approach to climate change means respecting human rights and ensuring that climate actions are good for the planet and good for people. I'm pleased to say that I'm not alone in this thinking, and there are many positive actions taking place. I'm very glad to acknowledge the work of a good friend and ally here at Wake Forest, Professor John Knox. As the UN independent expert on the issue of, in quotes, human rights obligations relating to the enjoyment of a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, Professor Knox has played a key role in progressing the issues of human rights and climate change. That has been recognized in Geneva today because the Human Rights Council has just reappointed him, but not just as an independent expert. They have reappointed him as a rapporteur, which is a stronger position. He will have more powers to do the work that he's called upon to do. But it's a great vindication of what he has been doing, and I know he's very supported by this university. I think he deserves a round of applause. His most recent contribution was the report on best practices relating to the use of human rights obligations and commitments to inform, support and strengthen environmental policymaking, which he presented to the 28th session of the Human Rights Council. Providing these best practice case studies, including the 6 in relation to climate change, is essential in progressing the discourse on human rights and climate change, but also practical in giving states examples of how to take a rights-based approach to their climate actions. In October 2014, Professor Knox and 26 other special procedures mandate holders of the Human Rights Council issued an open letter to states parties to the UN Framework on Climate Change, calling on them to strengthen the human rights commitments within the Paris Climate Agreement. They recommended that, and I quote, "Parties should, in all climate-related actions, fully respect, protect, promote and fulfill human rights." This call to action has been heard, and the current negotiating draft of the Paris Agreement contains exactly the human rights language that the special procedures mandate holders and others have called for. The challenge ahead of us now is to make sure that that language stays in the text as the negotiations progress. There's a growing consensus among states of the need to ensure that we address human rights within climate actions. A study commissioned by my foundation identified that some countries are actively linking human rights and climate change in their policy making and reporting on this both to the UN Framework on Climate and to the Human Rights Council. Unfortunately, these countries are in a small minority, and more work is needed to share and learn from these experiences and scale up these good practices. There are national governments who are already taking the lead with promising results for people and planet. Let me, for example, talk about what's happening in Vietnam, which is a climate-threatened country. The right to education is conferred on Vietnamese citizens in the country's constitution. Of specific importance to climate change, the constitution also recognizes the role of education for, and I quote, "regions and peoples with particular challenges, including vulnerable people living in the mountainous and low-lying parts of Vietnam." These rights are also reflected in Vietnam's national strategy and law on gender equality, which promote equal access to and benefits from policies on education and training. Consequently, the National Strategy on Climate Change, which was launched in 2011, achieves real significance in the context of rights through specific targets to guarantee, among other things, food security and gender equality. As a result, actions to adapt to climate-related disasters are informed by rights and are empowering previously vulnerable women to be actors in the national response to climate change. Women such as Ran Nguyen, a farmer in the Binh Dinh province in central Vietnam, who, like many farmers in rural Vietnam, has suffered due to increasingly frequent and severe storms associated with climate change, resulting in loss of life and livelihoods. Ran participated in a project implemented by UN Women, the government of Vietnam, and the Vietnam Women's Union to build the resilience of women and their communities to extreme climate events. As Ran put it herself, thanks to good preparation, nobody in the village was killed or injured in last year's storm season. Last month, my foundation co-hosted an event in Geneva with the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, where we brought the human rights experts who go for the countries to the Human Rights Council and the climate experts who go to the climate negotiations. We brought them together for a climate justice dialogue. Oh, and we gave them a good dinner as well, just to get them into the right mood. From this dialogue, the idea of the Geneva Pledge arose. The pledge, which was launched at the closing session of the Climate Convention and signed at that time by 18 countries, and more have since signed, looks to facilitate meaningful collaboration between national representatives in these two processes to increase the understanding of how human rights obligations inform better climate action. As a number of you may know from your own experience, very often one part of government doesn't know what the other part is doing. They don't have a joined up approach. So we're trying to join up the human rights and climate approach so that the climate policy will benefit. While progress is being made, the truth is that time is running out to avoid dangerous climate change. As I mentioned, France has the presidency of the climate agreement, which will take place in Paris in December. And I have heard the French Foreign Minister, Laurent Fabius, say in his beautiful French, which I won't attempt here, to say on a number of occasions what is a grim reality for all of us. He says, we are the first generation to fully understand the dangers of climate change, and the last generation with time to do something about it. The first generation to fully appreciate the dangers, and the last generation with time to do something about it. And that concentrates the mind. So this year, 2015, presents a unique opportunity to set the global community on a new path, away from fossil fuel-based development and towards a sustainable alternative that will ensure the protection of the rights of generations to come. In designing the global response to climate change, we have an opportunity to eradicate extreme poverty and ensure access to clean energy for all and achieve equitable access to sustainable development. Research recently commissioned by my foundation investigated how such a phase-out of fossil fuels might be achieved equitably. The research shows that actions by all countries are needed to save the planet for humanity. To deliver this action on the scale and in the time frame required to avoid dangerous climate change, the global community must act in solidarity and invest in the transition to zero carbon and zero poverty in all countries. The infrastructure and technologies we install today will affect emissions both today and throughout this century. The solution is to make a rapid transformation of our economic systems away from a dependence on carbon, while protecting the right to development of the poorest and most vulnerable people and countries. Let's just keep in mind that development requires energy, but not carbon emissions. We need to make that break in our minds. We tend to think of coal, gas, oil. Not necessarily. There are increasing alternatives: solar, wind, various wave power, thermo, hydro, lots of possibilities. The right to development of people in developing countries requires that they have access to alternative sources of energy to develop and lift themselves out of poverty. It's unreasonable to expect developing countries to reduce emissions on their own at an equivalent stage of development to when rich countries were dramatically increasing theirs. The only feasible way to achieve this is through the provision of support, both financial and technological, from those countries with greatest capacity. Only with this support will the phase-out be achieved on a timescale which avoids dangerous climate change for everybody. The good news is that many emerging and developing countries have been taking ambitious action across all the fronts needed to address climate change. Brazil has reduced net deforestation by 2/3 since 2004, which has delivered one of the greatest reductions in greenhouse gas emissions achieved anywhere in the world over the last decade. Ethiopia is aiming to become a middle-income country by 2025 through its work to move to carbon neutrality by that date, by 2025. Guyana will cut energy-related emissions by 92% by 2017, more than any country in the developed world, while maintaining over 99% of its forest, which is bigger than Britain. Small island developing states, including Dominica, the Maldives, Timor-Leste, Samoa, and many others, are showing how national-scale transitions to carbon neutrality can be achieved. Costa Rica has committed to be carbon neutral by 2021. So the ambition is coming from different parts of the world, but coming strongly from developing countries because they know they're in the front line of suffering from climate change. In a transition to zero carbon and zero poverty, the benefits outweigh the risks, with opportunities for developed and developing countries in terms of energy security, greater competitiveness, decreased mortality, job creation, and greater resilience. So we must act now. A carbon phase-out must begin quickly and extend globally, in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change and keep warming of the Earth's atmosphere as far below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels as possible. Effective climate actions need to be based on a human rights framework. Without attention to human rights, climate policies and actions can have unintended negative impacts on people's lives. We know that the risks to human rights from climate change are far more significant than the risks associated with a rapid phase-out of carbon emissions. However, this doesn't negate the need to ensure that all actions seek to address human rights and ensure a just transition. Perhaps more than any other problem humanity has faced, climate change confronts us with the reality of our interdependence. And that interdependence stems from the fact that no country alone can protect their citizens from the impacts of dangerous climate change. Climate change observes no boundaries. Therefore, solving the problem requires countries and citizens to act in solidarity, motivated by enlightened and, I would say, collective self-interest for a better future. Solidarity is at the core of climate justice. It's about sharing the benefits and burdens of climate change and our response to it. So somehow we have to encourage countries that base their development on fossil fuel and have become what we call the developed countries of the world will not have a safe world in the future unless they invest in a green infrastructure in those countries that haven't yet developed. Because if African countries, for example, and Africa will double its population by 2050, if African countries can't find a way to have clean energy, they will go dirty. And that will mean not just more climate extremes in African countries, it will mean more climate extremes everywhere because we won't stay below 2 degrees Celsius. It's that interconnection that is incredibly important, and we don't hear it, we don't feel it, we don't see it yet, but it is a reality that we're going to have to respond to more and more. And we have a great opportunity this year. We need to ensure that we use this opportunity and make a difference to ensure that our voices are heard and that we all become the voices of our time. I ask my colleagues in our foundation to be thought leaders in their personal lives and to put into practice the values and principles which we stand for in the foundation, and I try to do this myself. I also encourage all of you to be thought leaders in your homes, communities, and colleges. This isn't some abstract idea that we can let others worry about or political leaders worry about. It's something for every family, every school, every community, every college, every university, every women's organization, every youth group. We understand the problem and we know what has to be done, so we should take the action now and, as I quoted in the beginning, this is for young people your lunch counter moment. This is your lunch counter moment. It's also an issue of justice, an issue that requires that we address it from the perspective of justice. So I'd like to end with words that have become much quoted in the world from our beloved Irish poet. There have to be Irish people in the audience. Are there Irish people in the audience? Yes, good. I see lots of hands going up. Well, I'd like to end by quoting our beloved Nobel laureate Seamus Heaney, who tragically died a little bit before his time. And he wrote The Cure at Troy, and it goes as follows. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. It's that tidal wave of justice that could be transformative in our world. It could mean that some 3 billion people who don't have access to clean energy can have that access. The 1.4 or 5 billion who lack electricity and who spend too much to get the light from kerosene and candles and use diesel, and the 2.7 billion who cook on open fires, animal dung, coal, and who inhale indoor smoke that causes at least 4 million unnecessary deaths every year, mainly mothers cooking and the children who are too close to them while they're cooking. So we can have a tidal wave of the justice that means that they have access to the power to change their lives, access to renewable energy, to solar energy, to clean cook stoves, to all of the things that have become much more accessible. This is a wonderful challenge for young people today, to try to be transformative and to have a change from the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution created jobs and created wealth, but it left quite a lot of people behind. This time, with the Sustainable Development Goals and a good climate agreement, we have an opportunity, and this is what is being said internationally. This time, no one must be left behind. And that's the good side of climate justice, that those who are least responsible, because they don't drive cars and have air conditioning and all the use of fossil fuel, they can have the energy that will transform their lives. And that longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
So Mary, thank you very much on behalf of Wake Forest University, both for your inspirational remarks today, and also I just want to say thank you on behalf of Wake Forest for your inspirational career. You have done so much to protect human rights, the environment, to break barriers. You're really a wonderful example of just how much difference one person can make if she puts her mind to it. So we have some questions that I've been given to ask. As is your wont, you've done a wonderful job of clearly laying out the problem and also inspiring people to act to do something about it. I have to say, though, that in the United States, I feel that often people are discouraged. We keep waiting for our politicians to act, and they don't act. So this first question is, what can people in the United States do about climate change other than wait for our politicians to act and do something themselves?
Well, yes, I think what I've been saying with some emphasis is we don't have the luxury to wait. We're the last generation with the opportunity to do something about climate change, and that's all of us. So everybody can think about what I can do to put pressure on elected representatives. Here in North Carolina, in the States, I know it's sometimes difficult to think that that will matter, but believe me, having served in political life, politicians respond to momentum and movement. Indeed, the climate march last September did influence the discussions afterwards in the United Nations and among member states. That climate march really did make a difference. But also people can take more action in their own lives, at home and in the workplace, and demonstrate. Some business leaders are demonstrating leadership. More need to do it, and we need the cities to take the leadership. There's a lot of discussion now about what can be done at the level below the national level, and I think this is really important. It will be gathered in as the fourth pillar in Paris. What can cities do? What can business do? What can communities do? What can sectors do? There was a project, it's still going strong in Australia, of 1 million women. They decided to, ordinary housewives, if I can put it that way, decided to form a network and see how much they could reduce their own emissions and to link together. And I think the last time I was talking to them, there were 180,000 or something women, not yet 1 million, but they're working towards it because they felt that number would matter. So I think it's a case of really trying to say, how can we influence those who have more power, but take our own responsibility. And if you'll forgive me, John, I've often mentioned my own, sort of I have very much in my own mind as an Irish grandmother. I'm lucky enough to have these 5 grandchildren. They're young, so they'll be in their 40s in 2050. They'll share the world with at least 9 billion people. We know that. And I care not just about my narrow, my grandchildren. I care about that world of those 9 billion people and what kind of world it will be and what they will say about us. And they won't just talk about political leaders. They'll say, but surely they must all have understood. They must all have realized. Didn't they listen? Didn't they know what the science was saying? So that, that's where I think we can't escape an individual responsibility at this stage. It's all of us.
Broadening the scope a little bit to the responsibilities of rich countries generally, the second question asks, should the rich countries most responsible for climate change pay reparations to the countries most harmed by it?
I think that the reality is, as I've been saying, that the majority of the development this century will be in developing countries because they're underdeveloped. They haven't built their infrastructure. They want to develop. And I mean, India is talking about this at the moment. Modi has said he's going to get energy to his between 300 and 400 million people who don't have electricity. He wants to do as much as possible by solar, but he will also use coal because he can't, under current circumstances, see a way to do it all by solar. If we had wise leaders in the richer parts of the world, they would jump in and say, no, do it all by solar, because then we'll have a safer world. And it's not even development aid or charity or philanthropy. It's common sense that we need to help developing countries to move as rapidly as possible towards the way of developing that will keep us all safe for the future. That's the solidarity and self-interest, but it's a message that we still haven't quite got across, I think.
Still yet a broader question having to do, I think, with sustainable development generally. You referred to the Sustainable Development Goals, of course, which is a big topic of conversation right now. This last question asks, what international policies and practices should be established to ensure food and nutrition security, and how well does the global food system address sustainability?
That is a really important and big question. Indeed, your symposium could be focused on that alone, because climate is going to limit the capacity of land to deliver. Some of it's going to be flooded, some of it's going to suffer from drought. It's going to make it more difficult as we have a very sharp rise in population, as I said, to at least 9 billion by 2050. So we need to really focus on the fact that the Sustainable Development Goals must comprehensively address hunger and undernutrition. There is a lot of good work going on. I'm on the lead group of something called Scale Up Nutrition, the SUN movement, and it has become a real movement. There are 54 countries now that have signed on to scale up nutrition, not just as governments, but also as communities and civil society and business within those countries. And I think that that's a good movement. I had a great experience with the Irish government because Ireland has, for understandable reasons, because of the great famine that we suffered from in the 19th century, Ireland has always been a leader on world hunger. And we had a very good conference in 2013, the first part of 2013, 2 years ago now, with the Irish government when Ireland had the presidency of the European Union, and it was on hunger, nutrition, climate justice. And of the 400 participants to that conference, which took place in Dublin Castle in Dublin, there were commissioners from the EU countries, government ministers from other countries, Irish government ministers, but also 100 of the participants were from frontline communities all over the world. It was a magnificent experience to be sitting with real experts from various countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, Mongolia, the Arctic. They came for this conference. And I remember it was a very telling moment. There was a woman who stood up from the floor at a certain stage. We'd been sitting at learning circles and really got to know each other and worked hard for the 2 days of this international conference. And then there was a sort of final plenary. And this woman stood up and said, I keep hearing this phrase, that people are using, and it is we have to think outside the box. But in my community, we don't think in boxes. And, it was a very profound statement. Why are you in these silos where you don't make the connections? We don't think like that at local community, where all of the issues of water and food are all interconnected, and we have to deal with them. But it is true that this will be a huge issue in the future, and we need to have an increasing emphasis on smarter agriculture, conservation agriculture, agriculture that recognizes the responsibility to foster a way of doing that promotes livelihoods and forest communities and communities that will be the future in seeking to preserve the forests, but also our land and indeed our water, our fisheries. I mean, there is a huge problem of ocean acidity at the moment, and worry about species and the diversity of the species for the future. So for those here who are students here in Wake Forest, and I know there's a strong emphasis on sustainability, there are huge opportunities to grasp and grapple with the issues of our world today, and no bigger issue than making sure that we can have good food and nutrition for the rapidly growing population in our world at a time when we have climate constraints that are becoming ever more serious. Why don't you answer that question, John?
I think you've already answered it very well. Thank you. In the Harry Potter novels, of which some of you may have heard, Harry and his friends in one of the books organize themselves into a force to try and take on the forces of evil in the world, led by, of course, Voldemort, and they call themselves Dumbledore's Army, after their beloved headmaster. I just want to say that I think I speak for many of us when I say I'm happy to be considered part of Mary Robinson's army on this. So again, thank you so much, and thanks on behalf of all of us.
And thanks to all of you for being with us. You're dismissed.